Before we begin tonight's story, let me ask you something simple but important. What time is it where you're watching from? Drop it down in the comments because I love seeing how this journey stretches across time zones, across nights, across mornings that feel like nights. Now, dim the lights, let the room settle, and lean into the story. Let's start with the chapter 1. The Boy Who Counted Shadows. Pablo Emilio Escobar. Gaviria was not born into power, nor wrapped in the silk threads of destiny that some men inherit. He was born in Rio Negro, Colombia, in 1949. A boy with dirt under his fingernails, lungs filled with mountain fog, and eyes sharper than the knives carried by farmers who worked the hillsides. His father tilled the soil. His mother taught children their letters. And yet the child they raised spent more time watching the way coins changed hands in markets than he ever did reading textbooks. By age 10, he had already discovered the strange weight of money. Not in value, but in its ability to bend men's voices, to make them softer, more agreeable, as if silver could mute the human will. He bartered with cigarettes stolen from delivery trucks, sold tombstones he had scraped clean of names, and whispered into the ears of older boys that he could get them what they wanted cheaper, faster, quieter than anyone else. And in a place like Antioquia, where poverty wrapped itself around families like barbed wire, those whispers grew louder than sermons. They say the boy had a notebook, not filled with doodles, but with numbers, lists of debts, profits, losses, his own ledger of power before he even knew what power was. His cousins laughed. What kind of child keeps books instead of toys? But Pablo understood that toys break. Notebooks don't. He could already see that control wasn't about who swung the biggest stick, but who remembered every detail when everyone else forgot. When the 1970s cracked open, Colombia was already a country stitched with smuggling routes, emeralds, contraband electronics, liquor, marijuana, and young men with ambition learned quickly that the government's laws had as many holes as the dirt roads winding through the hills. Pablo slipped into that world as if born for it. At first it was harmless, or so it seemed. Cigarettes, stereos, second-hand cars. But then came the powder, cocaine, small, white, weightless in appearance, but heavier than oil in profit. Where others saw risk, Pablo saw an equation. Small packages, enormous returns, a product that addicts not only the body, but the mind, a product that erased hesitation in buyers and magnified fortune for sellers. He began carving airstrips into jungle clearings, bribing police officers who had never before seen such wads of cash, buying loyalty the way other boys bought candy. The Medellin Cartel was not yet a cartel, but in the muddy runways and candlelit negotiations of the late 1970s, its bones were forming. And Pablo, with his cousin Gustavo, as the quiet architect at his side, began shaping something that was neither business nor crime, but a hybrid of both. An empire born from the silence between heartbeats, nurtured in secrecy and destined to explode so loudly that the entire world would turn its head. He wanted not just money, but memory, not just wealth, but worship. And as the powder flowed north into the veins of Miami and New York, the boy who once sold gravestones began preparing his own for anyone foolish enough to stand in his way. Chapter 2. The King of Cocaine and the War on Sleep. By the early 1980s, Pablo Escobar was no longer a boy scribbling in a ledger. He was a man who counted his empire, not in pesos, but in tons of cocaine, rivers of cash, and entire neighborhoods loyal to his name. The Medellin Cartel, his creation, controlled nearly 80% of the world's cocaine trade, a number so surreal it bent the imagination. His fortune was estimated at more than $30 billion, and Forbes magazine listed him among the richest men alive, a titan whose wealth eclipsed nations. He buried cash in fields, stuffed it into walls, and lost hundreds of millions to mold and rats. Yet still, more came pouring in. They say he once offered to pay off Colombia's entire $10 billion national debt in exchange for immunity. And whether that was true or posturing, the fact that the government even entertained the offer tells you everything you need to know about how far his reach had extended. But wealth was never enough for Escobar. He understood something most gangsters never do. Power doesn't come from fear alone. It comes from theater. He built soccer fields for the poor, funded schools, handed out toys at Christmas, and became known as Don Pablo, a patron saint of the barrios. Mothers prayed for him. Children idolized him. In Medellin, his face was as familiar as Christ's. Yet, behind the smiles and the charity, stood shadows sharper than any halo. When politicians resisted him, they died in daylight. When judges dared whisper his name, their cars exploded. When journalists wrote too much truth, their offices turned to ash. His empire ran on a brutal currency. Plata o plomo, silver or lead. Take the bribe, or take the bullet. And still, even with billions in the bank, Pablo Escobar could not buy the one thing he wanted most: peace of mind. He slept in different houses every night, sometimes changing beds twice before dawn. He lined walls with steel, dug tunnels beneath estates, and surrounded himself with bodyguards whose loyalty was always bought but never trusted. Even his zoo at Hacienda Nápoles, with its hippos, giraffes, and elephants, was less a playground than a fortress disguised as fantasy. At night, he would walk the grounds, pistol in hand, listening to the animals breathe, wondering if the silence around him was real or just waiting to be broken. The DEA was closing in. Rival cartels, especially Cali, were circling. Vigilante groups funded by his enemies, Los Pepes, began assassinating his allies, burning his warehouses, sending his empire into panic. And still, the man could not rest. He feared extradition to the United States more than death itself. He once said he would rather die in Colombia than rot in an American prison. And by the late 1980s, he began making that prophecy real. His violence escalated into open war against the Colombian state. Car bombs in Bogotá, assassinations of presidential candidates, entire planes blown from the sky. It was no longer business. It was terror dressed as politics, empire disguised as rebellion. The king of cocaine had become a king without sleep, haunted by the very walls he built to protect himself. Every breath he took was measured, every night divided into fragments of pacing, listening, and rehearsing escape. And here lies the great paradox. Pablo Escobar controlled billions, commanded armies, bribed governments, yet could not lie down in a bed without imagining footsteps outside his door. His empire gave him everything but rest, and in that sleepless kingdom, death itself began to look less like an enemy and more like a release. Chapter 3. La Catedral, a palace of walls and whispers. When Pablo Escobar finally surrendered to Colombian authorities in 1991, it wasn't an act of defeat. It was theater, an illusion choreographed by a man who had turned war into a personal brand. The world called it prison. Pablo called it La Catedral. Perched high in the mountains overlooking Medellin, La Catedral was no ordinary penitentiary. Escobar himself designed it, chose the location, oversaw the construction, and even handpicked the guards, most of whom were his men in uniform. Instead of iron bars and concrete misery, it contained a soccer field, a billiards hall, a disco, a sauna, a bar stocked with whiskey, and a waterfall carved into stone like some absurd monument to luxury. There was even a rumor of secret rooms built for torture, where rivals or disloyal soldiers were escorted in alive and carried out silent. Imagine a prison where the inmates lived better than the people outside its gates, where steaks sizzled on grills every Sunday, and soccer matches drew cheers under the same sky that watched helicopters circle helplessly. To the government, it was a compromise. Contain Escobar, without provoking the kind of bloodshed that had already left hundreds dead. To Pablo, it was the ultimate statement. Even my punishment belongs to me. From inside, he continued running the Medellin Cartel with the same precision as before, holding meetings, settling scores, and ordering shipments. It was less incarceration, more coronation, a throne room disguised as confinement. But power, like concrete, cracks under pressure. Word spread quickly of the lavish conditions. Journalists published photos. International observers scoffed. The U.S. government, already seething from years of narco-terror, demanded answers. Colombian officials squirmed, embarrassed that their most secure facility looked more like a resort brochure. And Pablo, who had once built his reputation on invisibility, now found himself trapped by visibility. Guests grew fewer. Phone calls carried hesitation. Even the laughter at his dinner table began to sound forced, thin, like the echo of a party that knew the host was dangerous, but couldn't admit it. When two of his trusted lieutenants were caught stealing millions, Escobar had them summoned to La Catedral under the pretense of reconciliation. They left as corpses, dismembered and buried in shallow graves within the compound itself. That was the breaking point. It wasn't just rumors anymore. The Colombian government realized they hadn't caged a monster. They had given him a castle. Orders came down to move him to a real prison, one with steel bars, real guards, and rules not written by the inmate. Pablo didn't argue. He didn't plead. He vanished. One night in July 1992, as soldiers prepared to transfer him, they found empty rooms, cold plates, and a tunnel dug beneath the walls leading into the mountains. Escobar had escaped his own prison without a single bullet fired. The government was humiliated, the U.S. enraged, and the myth of Escobar grew fangs. Now he was not just a king, he was a ghost slipping through walls, a man who turned captivity into camouflage. But freedom didn't bring peace. It brought shadows. On the run, Escobar traded mansions for safe houses, silken sheets for thin mattresses, banquets for meals eaten in silence. And as he moved from hideout to hideout, hunted by enemies, betrayed by allies, and stalked by a government that had finally woken up, the man who built a palace to keep nightmares away discovered that nightmares travel lightly. They need no luggage. They follow wherever you go. Chapter 4. Los Pepes and the Kingdom of Fear. After La Catedral, Pablo Escobar was no longer a patron saint, no longer a benefactor of the barrios, no longer even a man in control of his empire. He was a fugitive in his own country, a king without a crown, chased not only by the Colombian state and the DEA, but by a new predator, far more ruthless than either. They called themselves Los Pepes, perseguidos por Pablo Escobar, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar. But they weren't merely victims seeking justice. They were a vigilante army, funded by the Cali Cartel, armed with intelligence from the Colombian government, and rumored to be backed quietly by the CIA. They hunted Escobar with the cruelty of men who had lost everything to his empire. They didn't just kill his associates, they erased them. They burned warehouses to the ground, tortured mistresses, kidnapped lawyers, slaughtered bodyguards. They strung corpses up on street corners as warnings, carved names into walls, and left messages that read, "Sleep with one eye open, patron." Escobar, once the master of fear, now lived inside its cage. His once loyal lieutenants defected, switching sides for promises of immunity. His allies disappeared. His fortune shrank, not from poverty but from pressure. Billions in hidden cash became unreachable as properties were seized, warehouses raided, and informants betrayed him. Safe houses that once welcomed him with food and fresh sheets now bolted their doors in silence. Even his family was no longer safe. His wife and children went into government protection, not as a kindness, but as bait. Each call he made to them risked triangulation. Each whispered, "I love you," carried the weight of a death sentence. And yet, he kept calling. For Pablo, the world was collapsing. But the sound of his son's voice, over crackling radio lines, remained the one tether to humanity he had left. Meanwhile, Los Pepes stalked him like wolves circling a wounded animal. They mutilated his accountant, dumped the bodies of his closest allies in rivers, and burned houses that had once hidden him. The Medellin Cartel, once a global empire, dissolved into fragments. The cocaine still flowed. Smaller shipments, scattered networks, but the center of gravity had shifted. Escobar was no longer a businessman. He was prey. He dyed his hair, wore glasses, used false names, He moved every 48 hours, slept on concrete floors, ate standing up, trusted no one. Even Gustavo Gaviria, his cousin and closest confidant, was eventually killed. When that news reached him, they say Pablo didn't cry. He simply went silent for 3 days, pacing back and forth in a safe house, whispering strategies to walls that no longer listened. By late 1993, the hunt had consumed everything. The DEA, Colombian intelligence, Los Pepes, all closing in, all sharpening the circle. Escobar's empire had become a skeleton, his fortune a myth, his name a liability, and yet he remained defiant. Better a grave in Colombia than a cell in the United States, he had once said. And those words now circled his every breath. The man who had once controlled billions, bought governments, and built his own prison now lived like a rat, hunted through alleys, rooftops, and shadows. His kingdom had not been conquered, it had been devoured. And in the silence of those nights, as he lay awake with pistol in hand, listening to the hum of radios and the footsteps of guards he no longer trusted, Pablo Escobar learned the cruelest lesson of power, that even kings cannot negotiate with sleep when the world itself has chosen to dream of their death. Chapter 5. The Rooftop Endgame. By December of 1993, Pablo Escobar was a man stretched thinner than the air in the mountains he once ruled from. His empire was dust, his family scattered, his wealth hidden in holes he could no longer reach. He was 44 years old, but his eyes looked centuries old, the kind of gaze forged from sleepless nights pacing, listening, calculating, rehearsing escape routes that grew shorter with each passing week. His last hideout was in a modest 2-story house in Los Olivos, a middle-class neighborhood where children still played soccer in the dirt streets, and mothers hung laundry from windows. Nothing about the house suggested it contained the most wanted man in the world. The walls were cracked, the furniture scarce, the food plain, but Pablo liked it for one reason. The roof, flat, wide, with a view over the block. He spent hours up there, scanning the horizon, watching life unfold around him, trying to convince himself he was still part of it, but he wasn't. By then, Escobar was a ghost that breathed. His only real joy came in short, fragile bursts, phone calls to his family, less than 2 minutes each, spoken in code, whispered in Spanish that sounded more like prayer than conversation. He couldn't stop himself. His son's voice, his daughter's laughter, his wife's silence, these were his final addictions. And like all addictions, they betrayed him. On December 2nd, 1993, one of those calls was traced. Colombian intelligence, aided by American technology, triangulated his signal to the Los Olivos neighborhood. The search block, a special unit trained to hunt Escobar, closed in. No sirens, no warnings, just boots on pavement and radios buzzing with coordinates. Pablo was eating lunch when he heard the first sounds. A neighbor's dog barking too frantically, a creak in the wooden stairwell. He didn't flinch. He had always known it would end this way. He grabbed his pistol, nodded to his bodyguard, and moved toward the roof. Upstairs, sunlight poured in harsh and unkind. He pushed through the door, stepped onto the tiles, and for the last time ran. He fired wildly, defiantly, but without precision. The agents fired back with the cold rhythm of training. A bullet tore his leg. Another pierced his back. And finally, one struck behind his ear. Some say it was fired by a soldier. Others swear it was his own hand that pulled the trigger. A final act of control in a life obsessed with it. Whatever the truth, the rooftop went still. Escobar lay face down, blood pooling beneath him, the pistol still warm in his hand. His bodyguard, El Limon, was already dead beside him. The world's richest outlaw, the king of cocaine, the patron saint of contradiction, ended not in a palace, not in a jungle stronghold, but on the rooftop of a rented house in a neighborhood where children played and mothers prayed. The search block gathered around his body, some posing for photos, others staring in disbelief. The radio crackled. Target neutralized. And in that moment, A city exhaled, not with cheers, but with something quieter, a sigh, a relief, a fatigue, deeper than joy. For Medellin, the war was not over, but the king who ruled it without sleeping was gone. Pablo Escobar's death did not end the drug trade. It did not cure Colombia of its violence, or America of its appetite for powder. His empire fractured, his rivals rose, his methods were copied, refined, globalized. But something did end that day on the rooftop. A chapter of fear, so loud it made the world lean closer, just to hear the silence that followed. Medellin slowly changed. Streets once patrolled by sicarios became playgrounds. The zoo at Hacienda Nápoles fell into ruin, its animals wandering into rivers like ghostly heirs of a kingdom that outlived its king. The hippos, strange and stubborn, bred uncontrollably, and still roam Colombia today, as if mocking the state that could not contain the man who imported them. His family vanished into exile, his name transformed into a brand, sold in t-shirts, retold in Netflix series, debated in classrooms, whispered in the same barrios, where grandmothers still light candles for the man they called Don Pablo. Was he a saint? A devil? A tyrant? A Robin Hood? Perhaps he was all of them, or perhaps he was something simpler. A man who feared nothing except the stillness of sleep, because that, in the end, is what his story tells us. Power cannot buy peace. Money cannot buy trust. And empires built on fear are empires where the king himself becomes the most hunted animal of all. Tonight, as you close your eyes, you can let his story fade into the background hum of history. The rooftop is quiet now. The radios are silent. The footsteps have stopped. The king who never trusted the night is gone, but you are still here, safe, breathing, in a room that belongs to you. You do not need tunnels, or guards, or pistols under pillows. You need only rest. Let the echoes of Pablo Escobar's empire drift like smoke. Let the shadows dissolve into dreams, and let your body sink into something he never found. Sleep without fear.